What would you do if the toughest guy you knew picked a fight with a stranger and lost everything in the blink of an eye? The dusty streets of Willow Creek hummed with the lazy rhythm of a late summer afternoon, a sleepy little town where the sun hung low and golden, casting long shadows over weathered storefronts and cracked sidewalks. The air carried the faint scent of gasoline and warm asphalt, mingling with the sweet aroma of pie wafting from a corner bakery. Locals shuffled along, their steps slow and familiar, old men tipping their hats, kids chasing a stray ball, a shopkeeper sweeping the porch with a worn-out broom. It was the kind of place where not much happened, where the biggest excitement was a stray cat napping on a porch swing. That is, until the ground began to tremble, a low growl rising in the distance, growing louder, closer, until it erupted into a roar that shattered the stillness like a thunderclap. Heads turned, conversations halted, and eyes widened as a pack of motorcycles roared around the bend, kicking up swirling clouds of dust like a storm on the horizon. Johnny Blaze Maddox led the charge, a hulking figure astride a gleaming black Harley that growled louder than a caged beast. He was a big man, broad shoulders straining against a weathered leather jacket, dark, wild hair whipping in the wind, and a scruffy beard framing a face that always wore a smug grin, as if he knew something the world didn't. His biker gang trailed behind him, a rough crew of rebels in leather who lived for the open road and the thrill of chaos. To them, Johnny wasn't just a leader. He was a legend, a guy who always had a sharp quip, a reckless dare, or a fist ready to prove they were the meanest sons of bitches around. They'd rolled into Willow Creek looking for a pit stop, a place to kick back with a few beers and maybe stir things up a bit. Just enough to remind this quiet town they existed, that they ruled the edges of the map where law and order faded into dust. The bikes screeched to a halt outside a quaint little cafe called the Rusty Spoon, its faded red awning fluttering in the breeze, a chalkboard sign out front promising fresh coffee and homemade pie. The townsfolk froze mid-step, their peaceful day suddenly ruptured by the rumble of engines and the sight of these grizzled outsiders. Some pulled their kids closer, others ducked their heads and hurried inside, hoping the bikers would pass through like a gust of wind. But Johnny wasn't the type to pass through anywhere unnoticed. He swung a leg over his bike, his heavy boots hitting the ground with a solid thud, and surveyed the scene like a wolf sizing up a flock of sheep. His gang fanned out behind him, cracking knuckles and tossing smirks at the nervous onlookers, guys with tattoos snaking up their arms, scars telling tales of bar fights and backroad brawls. Johnny loved this. The stares, the whispers, the way people tensed up as he walked by. It fed something in him, a hunger to be seen, to be feared, to prove he was untouchable. As he strode toward the cafe, his gaze snagged on something that made his grin widen. A pair of dogs sitting calmly near the entrance, tethered to a post under the awning. One was a golden retriever, its honey-colored fur glinting in the sunlight, big brown eyes soft and trusting as it watched the world go by. The other was a sleek German shepherd, black and tan, its posture ramrod straight, ears perked like a soldier on guard. They were clean, well-fed, the kind of pets that belonged to someone who cared enough to brush them daily and teach them manners. Johnny elbowed one of his buddies, a wiry guy named Tank with a chipped tooth, and chuckled, his voice rough as gravel. "Check out these pampered little princes," he said, loud enough for the cafe patrons to hear. "Living better than us, huh? Probably sleep on silk pillows and eat steak for breakfast?" His gang laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed down the street like a warning shot. Johnny's grin sharpened, a plan already forming in his head. He lived for moments like this, small chances to flex his power, to make his crew laugh, to remind everyone he was the top dog in any pack. Those dogs, sitting there so calm and perfect, were just too tempting a target. He didn't think much of it, didn't care who they belonged to or why they were there. To him, it was all a game, a quick way to stir things up and watch the ripples spread. So with a swagger in his step, he lifted a heavy boot, its leather scuffed from years of riding and fighting, and gave the golden retriever a light kick. Not hard enough to break anything, but firm enough to jolt the poor animal out of its quiet daze. The dog yelped, a sharp, startled sound, stumbling back on its hind legs, its gentle eyes wide with confusion and a flicker of fear. The German shepherd shot to its feet, standing tall, muscles taut under its glossy coat, but its training held it back from lunging. Silence blanketed Willow Creek. The cafe patrons gasped. A waitress balancing a tray of iced tea fumbled, the glasses crashing onto the sidewalk with a clatter that broke the hush. A little girl, clutching a melting ice cream cone, squeezed it so hard the scoop plopped to the ground, her mother pulling her close and whispering, "Oh no." The townsfolk stared, frozen, their peaceful afternoon upended by this sudden, random act of cruelty. Johnny threw his head back and laughed, a deep booming sound that bounced off the cafe's brick walls, pleased with the chaos he'd sparked. His gang chuckled too, though it was a nervous, uneven sound. Tank muttered under his breath, maybe that wasn't the best move, boss." But Johnny waved him off. It was just a dog, right? Just a little fun. What's the big deal? What Johnny didn't know, what no one in his gang could have guessed, was that those two dogs belonged to Leonardo DiCaprio. And inside the Rusty Spoon, behind a window streaked with afternoon light, Leonardo had seen everything. He'd been sitting at a small table near the glass, cradling a steaming mug of black coffee, savoring the stillness of this nowhere town, a rare break from the flashing cameras and red carpets that defined his life. The yelp of his golden retriever cut through that stillness like a knife, and his hand froze mid-air, the mug hovering just above the table. His sharp blue eyes, usually warm, thoughtful, the kind that charmed millions, narrowed as they shifted from his coffee to the scene outside. He saw his retriever stumble, confused and scared. He saw his German shepherd rise, alert and protective. And then he saw the man responsible, the leather-clad biker laughing like it was all a joke, oblivious to the storm he'd just unleashed. Leonardo set his mug down slowly, the soft clink of ceramic on wood the only sound in the sudden hush of the cafe. The owner, a salt-and-pepper-haired man with a kind face, had seen it too. His skin paled as he realized what was coming. He shuffled closer to Leonardo's table, his whispered voice trembling. "Sir, I think that biker just made a terrible mistake." Leonardo didn't respond. He didn't need to. He rose from his chair, his movements smooth and deliberate, his lean frame carrying a quiet strength that didn't need to shout to be felt. The other cafe patrons, locals sipping lemonade, a trucker nursing a Coke, exchanged wide-eyed glances. They knew who he was, not just from the movies, but from the stories. The man who'd trained with stuntmen, studied martial arts, lived a disciplined life behind Hollywood's glitz. This wasn't just an actor about to step outside. This was a man who knew how to handle trouble. And Johnny Blaze Maddox was about to find out just how much trouble he'd stirred up. The yelp of the golden retriever still hung in the air like a crack across thin glass, a sound that sliced through the lazy hum of Willow Creek and left an uneasy silence in its wake. Johnny Blaze Maddox stood there, his heavy boot hovering an inch above the dusty pavement, his broad shoulders shaking with a deep, rumbling laugh that echoed from his chest. To him, it was nothing. A flick of the foot, a startled dog, a ripple of chaos to spice up a dull afternoon. His crew fed off his amusement, their chuckles rolling out in uneven waves, though Tank's muttered warning lingered like a faint echo no one cared to hear. But the townsfolk didn't laugh. The waitress at the Rusty Spoon stood frozen, her shattered tray forgotten at her feet, shards of glass glinting in the sunlight like tiny warnings. A mother clutched her daughter tighter, the child's ice cream now a sad puddle on the ground, her wide eyes darting between the bikers and the dogs. The old shopkeeper stopped sweeping, his broom drooping in his hands. his weathered face creasing with something between shock and dread. Johnny tilted his head back, letting his wild hair whip in the breeze, and scanned the crowd with that signature half-smirk, half amusement, half challenge. "What's wrong with you people?" he called out, his gravelly voice cutting through the stillness. "It's just a mutt. I didn't break its leg or anything." He nudged Tank again, who forced a grin but shifted uncomfortably, his chipped tooth catching the light. "Look at 'em, all quaking over a little tap. This town's softer than a pillow factory." This time, his gang laughed louder, egged on by his bravado, their boots scuffing the sidewalk as they spread out like wolves circling a herd. To Johnny, this was his stage. Every gasp, every nervous glance from the townsfolk was fuel for the fire he loved to stoke. He didn't care about the dogs or their owner. He cared about the spotlight, the way his crew hung on his every move, the way he could bend a quiet day to his will. The golden retriever whimpered softly, stepping back, its bushy tail tucked low as it pressed closer to the German shepherd. The shepherd, still rigid, let out a low growl, a warning rumbling deep in its throat. But its training kept it steady, its dark eyes flicking between Johnny and the cafe door. The townsfolk watched, holding their breath, as if they could sense the storm brewing just beneath the surface of this sunlit afternoon. A few of them stole quick glances toward the rusty spoon, where the window framed a lone figure inside, a man invisible to Johnny's swaggering crew until now. The cafe owner, his graying hair peeking out from under a faded cap, took a hesitant step toward the glass, his hands twisting the corner of his apron. He'd seen the kick, heard the yelp, and now his eyes widened with a mix of fear and realization as he whispered to no one in particular, "Oh Lord, that was a bad move." Inside the cafe, Leonardo DiCaprio sat motionless at his small table, steam from his untouched coffee curling up in lazy spirals. Sunlight streamed through the window, bathing the wooden floor in a warm glow, catching the faint lines etched into his face. Lines carved by years under the spotlight and beyond it. He'd come to Willow Creek for this very stillness, a chance to sip his coffee and watch the world drift by without the weight of fame pressing down. His dogs, tethered outside, were his companions in this escape, loyal, steadfast, a piece of normalcy in a life that rarely allowed it. The golden retriever's yelp had split that piece in two. His hand, still gripping the mug's handle, tightened for a moment, knuckles whitening briefly before he set it down with deliberate calm. The soft clink of ceramic on wood was the only sound in the cafe, starkly at odds with the chaos unfolding outside. Leonardo's sharp blue eyes lifted, cutting through the glass to the scene beyond. He saw his retriever, his gentle, trusty friend, cowering, its soft fur bristling, its eyes clouded with confusion. He saw his shepherd, stiff and vigilant, a coiled spring of loyalty ready to protect but held back by years of discipline. And then he saw Johnny, laughing, smirking, standing there like a king who thought the world was his playground. Leonardo's jaw clenched, a subtle shift betraying the storm stirring beneath his composed exterior. He wasn't one to fly into a rage or shout threats. He didn't need to. His strength wasn't loud. It was deep, forged through years of training for roles that demanded more than a pretty face, honed by a life that taught him how to master chaos. The cafe owner shuffled closer, his voice a nervous hiss. "Sir, that biker, he doesn't know what he's done. Those are your dogs." Leonardo didn't reply. He didn't need to. He pushed his chair back, its legs scraping lightly against the floor, and stood, his lean frame unfolding with a quiet grace that carried more weight than any shout. The other patrons, a farmer in overalls, a young couple sharing pie, froze mid-bite, their forks hovering as they exchanged looks. They knew him, not just as the Oscar-winning actor whose posters lined theater walls, but as the man who'd rolled into their town a few times before, always polite, always reserved. They'd heard the rumors, too, how he'd learned boxing for films, trained with real fighters, carried a discipline that went beyond the screen. Now, as he straightened the hem of his simple jacket and took a measured step toward the door, they felt it. This wasn't just Leonardo DiCaprio stepping outside. This was a man who'd faced bigger threats than a loudmouthed biker, and always came out on top. Outside, Johnny was still basking in the moment, oblivious to the shift in the air. He kicked a pebble across the sidewalk, sending it skittering toward the cafe steps, then turned to his crew with a wide grin. "See? Told you this place needed waking up. Bet these folks haven't seen action like this in years." Tank nodded, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the cafe, catching a shadow moving behind the glass. "Boss, maybe we should—" he started, but Johnny cut him off with a wave. "Relax, Tank. What's the worst that could happen? Some farmer's gonna yell at me over a dog." His laugh rang out again, but it faltered as the cafe door creaked open, the hinges groaning like a warning bell. Leonardo stepped out, his boots hitting the wooden porch with a slow, steady thud that somehow sounded louder than it should. The sunlight caught the edge of his face, sharpening the lines of his jaw, his eyes locking onto Johnny with a calm that felt more dangerous than any glare. The gang's laughter died in their throats, replaced by the uneasy shuffle of boots on gravel. Johnny straightened, his smirk still in place, but something about the way Leonardo stood, hands relaxed, shoulders square, head slightly tilted, made his stomach tighten. The townsfolk held their breath, the waitress clutching her apron, the shopkeeper gripping his broom like a lifeline. They'd seen trouble before, drunken scuffles, petty theft, but this was different. This was a spark meeting a fuse, and Willow Creek was about to find out what happened when Johnny Blaze Maddox picked the wrong man to mess with. Johnny crossed his arms, puffing out his chest to reclaim the moment. "What's this? Dog police here to ticket me?" he said, his voice loud but laced with a thread of doubt. His gang chuckled, but it was weaker now, their eyes darting between their leader and the man on the porch. Leonardo didn't flinch. He took another step, descending the stairs with that same deliberate rhythm, his gaze never wavering. "You kicked my dog," he said, his voice low and even, each word dropping like a stone into still water. The simplicity of it, the absence of anger, the quiet certainty, hit Johnny harder than any shout could have. His smirk faltered, and for the first time that day, he felt the ground shift beneath his boots. The silence that followed Leonardo DiCaprio's words, "You kicked my dog," settled over Willow Creek like a thick, unrelenting fog, heavy and unyielding, swallowing the last echoes of Johnny Blaze Maddox's bravado. His smirk hung on his face like a mask slipping off its peg, arms still crossed, but fingers twitching against the leather of his jacket. The words weren't loud, weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. They carried a weight that pressed down on Johnny's chest, a quiet force that turned his gang's chuckles into awkward coughs and shifting boots. The townsfolk watched from their frozen positions, the waitress with her apron twisted tight in her fists, the shopkeeper clutching his broom, the mother shielding her daughter's eyes as if they could feel the air tightening, the calm before a storm they'd only read about in books. The golden retriever whimpered again, edging closer to the German shepherd, whose low growl rumbled like distant thunder, its black eyes fixed on Johnny with the same wariness as its master. Johnny tried to laugh, though it came out hoarse and ragged, like gravel caught in his throat. "Your dog, huh?" he said, raising his voice to reclaim the space Leonardo's presence had stolen. "What's the big deal, pal? Just a little tap. The mutt's fine, see? Still wagging its tail." He gestured toward the retriever, aiming for nonchalance, but his eyes flicked to his crew for backup. Tank nodded reluctantly, his chipped tooth flashing in a weak grin, but the others, guys with names like Razor and Spike, shifted uneasily, their usual swagger fading under the weight of Leonardo's stare. Johnny puffed out his chest again, stepping forward to close the gap between him and the man on the cafe steps. "You gonna cry about it or something? This ain't a pet store. This is my turf now." His voice carried defiance, but there was a crack in it, a sliver of doubt he couldn't bury completely. Leonardo didn't budge. He stood at the base of the steps, hands loose at his sides, his lean frame solid as a pillar against Johnny's bluster. His sharp blue eyes locked onto Johnny, unblinking, cutting through the biker's showmanship like a blade through paper. The sunlight caught the stubble on his jaw, a face that had seen more than just movie sets, a face that carried stories of discipline, of battles won not with noise, but with precision. "You think it's funny," he said, his voice still low, still calm, but now laced with something colder, something that made the hairs on Johnny's neck stand up. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a mirror held up to Johnny's actions, forcing him to face the reflection he'd dodged all day. Johnny's smirk twitched, his confidence unraveling at the edges. He wasn't used to this. People usually backed down when he got loud, when he flexed his strength, when his gang loomed behind him like a wall of muscle and ink. But Leonardo didn't flinch, didn't retreat, didn't even raise his voice. That stillness unnerved Johnny more than any shout could have. "Yeah, I think it's funny," he shot back, forcing bravado. "What you gonna do about it, pretty boy? Call the sheriff? Write me a ticket?" He laughed again, louder this time, turning to his gang for support. "This guy thinks he's tough 'cause he's got some fancy dogs. Probably cries when they get fleas." Tank snickered, but it was a hollow sound, and the others stayed quiet, their eyes darting between their leader and the man who hadn't moved an inch. The cafe owner poked his head out from the doorway, his gray hair peeking from under his cap, his face pale as he whispered to the waitress, "He's pushing it too far. That's Leonardo DiCaprio. He doesn't mess around." The waitress nodded, her hands trembling as she picked up a shard of glass from her broken tray, her eyes wide with anticipation. The townsfolk started murmuring, their voices low with excitement and fear, some of them now recognizing Leonardo, whispering his name like a secret passed around a campfire. "That's the guy from the movies," an old man muttered, adjusting his hat. "He's not just an actor. He knows how to fight," a younger woman added, clutching her phone, debating whether to record what was about to happen next. Leonardo tilted his head slightly, studying Johnny like a scientist examining a specimen under glass. "You want to test me," he said, his voice just above a whisper, but it carried across the street with the force of a gunshot. "Go ahead. Try it." The words hung there, simple, direct, a challenge wrapped in quiet certainty. Johnny's stomach twisted. He'd been in brawls before, taken down bigger guys, walked out of bar fights with blood on his knuckles and a grin on his face. But something about Leonardo's stillness, the way he didn't need to posture or yell, made Johnny's palms sweat beneath his leather gloves. He couldn't back down, though. Not with his gang watching, not with the whole town staring, not with his pride screaming louder than his common sense. "All right, tough guy," Johnny growled, stepping closer until they were just a few feet apart, his shadow falling over Leonardo. "You want to dance? Let's dance." He cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the tense air, and rolled his shoulders like a boxer stepping into the ring. His gang perked up, sensing a fight, their boots scuffing the gravel as they edged closer, ready to cheer their leader on. Johnny swung his fist, a wild, heavy punch aimed straight at Leonardo's jaw, fueled by frustration and the need to prove he was still king of this moment. The townsfolk gasped, a collective breath that seemed to suck the oxygen from the street. But Leonardo moved, fast, fluid, like water slipping through fingers. He dodged the punch with a grace that belied his calm demeanor, his body shifting just enough for Johnny's fist to sail past, hitting nothing but air. In the same motion, Leonardo's hand shot out, clamping onto Johnny's wrist in an iron grip, twisting it just enough to throw the biker off balance. With a swift pull, he used Johnny's own momentum against him, sending him stumbling forward into the wooden railing of the cafe. The railing cracked under Johnny's weight, splintering with a loud snap as he crashed into it, his leather jacket snagging on the jagged edge. He hit the ground hard, dust billowing around him, his gang staring in stunned silence as their leader sprawled on his back, blinking up at the sky. The townsfolk let out a collective, "Oh!" some in shock, others with stifled grins. Tank took a step forward, then stopped, his chipped tooth vanishing as his mouth clamped shut. Johnny scrambled to his knees, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage, his hair matted with dirt. "You son of a—" he started, but Leonardo cut him off, stepping closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You still laughing?" Leonardo asked, his voice even, his gaze piercing through Johnny's bluster. Johnny pushed himself up, chest heaving, his pride stinging more than the bruises forming on his ribs. He couldn't let this stand. Not here, not now. He charged again, this time lower, aiming to tackle Leonardo to the ground, hoping raw strength would win where speed had failed. Leonardo didn't flinch. He pivoted at the last second, planting a foot and delivering a quick, controlled elbow to Johnny's shoulder as he barreled past. The strike wasn't hard, just enough to redirect Johnny's momentum, sending him crashing into a stack of metal chairs outside the cafe. The chairs toppled with a shrill clatter, one bouncing off Johnny's knee as he went down again, groaning as he clutched his leg. His gang froze, their bravado crumbling, their eyes wide as they watched their invincible leader writhe on the ground. The townsfolk murmured louder now, some chuckling behind their hands, others shaking their heads in disbelief. "He's done for," the old man muttered, tipping his hat back. "Should have left the dogs alone," the woman with the phone added, her screen now capturing every second. Johnny rolled to his side, gasping, his leather jacket scraped and torn, his pride bleeding out with every labored breath. Leonardo stood over him, hands still relaxed, expression unchanged, calm, focused, unshaken. "You wanted a fight," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You got one. What's next?" The question hung in the air, a challenge Johnny couldn't ignore, even as his body screamed at him to stay down. His crew shifted uneasily, Tank muttering, "Boss, maybe we should—" But Johnny waved him off, his eyes blazing with a mix of fury and desperation. He wasn't done. Not yet. He staggered to his feet, wiping dirt from his face, his mind racing for a way to turn this around, to save face in front of his crew in this damn town. The tension coiled tighter, the street holding its breath, waiting for Johnny's next move, and Leonardo's inevitable response. Dust still swirled around Johnny Blaze Maddox as he staggered to his feet, his leather jacket torn at the shoulder, his hair matted with dirt and sweat. The clatter of the fallen metal chairs outside the Rusty Spoon echoed through Willow Creek's stunned silence, a harsh sound that seemed to scrape against the thickening tension in the air. His chest heaved, each breath a ragged gasp, his ribs aching from their collision with the cafe railing, his knee throbbing from the chair that had clipped it on his way down. His gang stood motionless behind him, Tank's jaw clenched around his chipped tooth, Razor and Spike exchanging wide-eyed glances, their usual swagger replaced by a spreading unease they couldn't shake. The townsfolk watched from every corner of the street, their faces a mix of shock, amusement, and quiet anticipation. The waitress clutching her apron, the old shopkeeper leaning on his broom, the mother whispering to her daughter, as the girl peeked out with curious eyes. The golden retriever whimpered softly, pressing against the German shepherd, whose growl had faded into a steady, watchful silence, its dark eyes locked on Johnny like a sentinel awaiting orders. Johnny wiped a streak of dirt from his cheek, his hand trembling slightly, though he tried to mask it by balling it into a fist. His pride burned hotter than the bruises spreading across his body. Leonardo DiCaprio had put him down twice, effortlessly, without even breaking a sweat. The laughter he'd stirred earlier had turned on him, the townsfolk's hushed whispers and stifled chuckles stinging like salt in an open wound. He couldn't let this stand, not in front of his gang, not in this nowhere town he'd planned to dominate with a smirk and a kick. His eyes blazed with desperate fury, his mind racing to reclaim this moment, to prove he was still the toughest bastard on two wheels. "You think you're some hotshot son of a bitch, huh?" he growled, his voice rough and uneven, cracking under the weight of his humiliation. "Some Hollywood prick thinks he can waltz in here and make me look small? I ain't done with you yet." Leonardo stood a few feet away, his lean frame steady as a rock in a storm. Hands still relaxed at his sides, his sharp blue eyes cutting through Johnny's bluster with unshakable calm. The sunlight glinted off the stubble on his jaw, casting shadows that sharpened a face that had seen more than red carpets and award shows. A face that carried the quiet strength of a man who'd faced chaos and come out on top. He didn't respond right away, letting Johnny's words hang in the air like smoke, dissipating into nothing. His crew shifted uncomfortably, Tank muttering under his breath, "Boss, maybe we should—" But Johnny silenced him with a sharp glare, his pride drowning out the warning bells ringing in his head. He couldn't back down, not now, not with every eye in Willow Creek on him, waiting to see if he'd crumble or fight. Johnny spat on the ground, a wet glob landing near Leonardo's boots, a final act of defiance to summon his own courage. "You want to play tough?" he snarled, reaching into his jacket pocket with a trembling hand. The townsfolk gasped as his fingers emerged, clutching a switchblade, its silver edge flashing in the afternoon light as he flicked it open with a sharp snap. The blade quivered slightly in his grip, betraying the nerves he tried to bury beneath his scowl. "Let's see how tough you are now, pretty boy," he said, stepping forward, his boots crunching on the gravel as he lowered the knife, poised to lunge. His gang tensed, some stepping back, others clenching their fists as if weighing whether to jump in. The cafe owner ducked behind the door frame, whispering, "Oh God, he's lost it," while the waitress gripped her tray's broken shard tighter, her knuckles white. The old shopkeeper shook his head, muttering, "That fool's digging his own grave." Leonardo's gaze flicked to the blade, then back to Johnny's face, his expression unchanged, calm, focused, almost bored. The townsfolk held their breath, some stepping back, others leaning forward, their whispers buzzing with fear and excitement. "He's got a knife now," the young woman with the phone hissed, her camera still rolling. "Think he'll back off?" the old man replied, lifting his hat. But Leonardo didn't back off. He sighed, a soft, resigned sound that carried more weight than Johnny's threat, and shook his head slightly. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he said, his voice even, slicing through the tension like a wire through clay. Johnny's jaw tightened, his pride screaming louder than his survival instinct. He couldn't walk away, not with the blade in his hand, not with his gang watching, not with this damn town waiting to see him fall. With a hoarse yell, Johnny lunged, the knife slashing toward Leonardo's side in a wild, desperate arc. The crowd gasped, a collective sound that pierced the air, but Leonardo moved, faster than anyone expected, a blur honed by years of training. His hand shot out, catching Johnny's wrist mid-strike, his fingers locking around it in a steel grip. In one fluid twist, he turned the biker's arm inward, forcing the knife to clatter onto the sidewalk with a loud clang. Johnny groaned, his knees buckling under the sudden pressure, but Leonardo didn't stop there. With a swift step, he swept Johnny's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground once more, dust exploding around him like a cloud of defeat. The knife skidded away, landing near the cafe steps, its blade glinting uselessly in the sun. Johnny hit the dirt with a heavy thud, his breath knocked out of him, his gang staring in dumbfounded shock as their leader sprawled out again. The townsfolk erupted, some shouting, "Holy hell!" others clapping despite themselves, their fear giving way to awe. Tank took half a step forward, then froze, his hands hovering uselessly. Johnny rolled onto his back, gasping, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes wide with a mix of rage and confusion. Leonardo stood over him, still calm, still unshaken, his boots planted firmly on the ground. "That how you have fun?" he asked, his voice low but sharp, each word a nail in the coffin of Johnny's pride. Johnny scrambled to his knees, clutching his wrist where Leonardo had left a red mark, his chest heaving as he groped for words, any words, to salvage a shred of dignity. But the real climax didn't come from the fight, not from the knife. It came from Leonardo's next move, a sudden shift that silenced the street more than any punch could. He stepped closer, crouching slightly to meet Johnny's eyes, his voice dropping to a near whisper that only the biker and a few nearby could hear. "I could break you right now," he said, his tone even, matter-of-fact, devoid of anger. "But that's not strength. Strength is knowing when to walk away and giving you the chance to do the same." He paused, letting the words sink in, then straightened up, his gaze shifting to the dogs still tethered by the cafe. The golden retriever wagged its tail faintly, sensing its master's calm, while the German shepherd sat tall, unwavering. Johnny froze, his breath ragged, his mind reeling from the words more than the fall. The townsfolk leaned in, straining to catch what was said, their murmurs fading as they saw the shift in Johnny's face, rage giving way to something else, something raw and unnameable. His gang stood silent, their fists unclenching, their bravado stripped bare. Leonardo didn't wait for a response. He stepped back, brushing the dust from his hands and turning toward his dogs, his movements deliberate, unhurried, as if the fight had been a minor detour in his day. But then Johnny's hoarse voice rasped out, trembling but defiant. "This ain't over, you hear me?" He pushed himself up, staggering to his feet, his pride clawing for one last stand. He reached for the knife, his fingers grazing the handle, his eyes burning with a near-mad desperation. Leonardo paused, half turning back, his eyes locking on to Johnny once more. "Pick it up," he said, his voice calm but laced with a thread of steel that made the air shiver. "Go ahead. See what happens." The challenge wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive. It was a quiet promise, a line drawn in the sand that Johnny couldn't cross without breaking himself completely. The townsfolk held their breath, the cafe owner peering out with wide eyes, the waitress whispering, "He's done for if he does it." Johnny's hand hovered over the blade, trembling, his chest pounding under the weight of every stare. His gang, the town, Leonardo. For a moment, time stretched, the street teetering on the edge of something irreversible. Then Johnny's hand fell limp. He stumbled back, his shoulders slumping, his breath escaping in a shuddering rush. He didn't pick up the knife. He couldn't. Not because he feared Leonardo's strength, he'd felt that already, but because those words, that calm offer of mercy, hit him harder than any blow. His crew stared, jaws slack, as their leader stood there, defeated not by force but by something deeper, something he didn't even yet understand. The townsfolk erupted again, this time with applause, not just for Leonardo's skill, but for the way he'd ended it without blood, without hate. Johnny's eyes met Leonardo's one last time, and for the first time that day, he didn't see a Hollywood star, not a fighter, but a man who'd given him a way out he didn't deserve. And he'd taken it, whether he wanted to or not. The switchblade lay untouched in the dust of Willow Creek's main street, its silver blade catching the fading sunlight like a falling star, a silent testament to the moment Johnny Blaze Maddox's world shifted beneath his boots. He stood there, his hulking frame slouched, his wild hair hanging in sweaty clumps over a dirt-streaked face, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The fire in his eyes, once a roaring blaze of pride and defiance, had dulled to a flicker, replaced by a raw, unnameable weight, pressing down on his shoulders harder than any blow Leonardo DiCaprio had landed. His gang stood behind him, a scattered line of leather and ink, their faces a mix of shock and uncertainty, Tank's chipped tooth hidden behind a tight-lipped grimace, Razor and Spike staring at the ground, their usual bravado buried under the rubble of their leader's defeat. The townsfolk watched from the sidelines, their applause fading into soft murmurs, their eyes on Johnny and Leonardo with relief, awe, and quiet respect. Leonardo stepped back from the scene, his boots crunching lightly on the gravel as he turned toward his dogs. The golden retriever wagged its tail, a cautious thump against the sidewalk, its soft brown eyes brightening as it sensed the tension easing. The German shepherd sat tall, its ears relaxing slightly, though its gaze lingered on Johnny a moment longer, as if ensuring the threat was truly gone. Leonardo crouched beside them, his hand running gently over the retriever's soft fur, smoothing the ruffled patches where Johnny's boot had struck. "You're okay, buddy," he murmured, his voice low and warm, a stark contrast to the steel he'd shown minutes before. The dog licked his hand, a small gesture of trust that seemed to settle the last ripples of chaos in the air. He stood, brushing dust from his jeans, and glanced at Johnny, not with triumph, not with scorn, but with a calm that carried one final unspoken message. Johnny didn't meet his eyes. He couldn't. His hand hovered near the knife for one more heartbeat, then dropped to his side, his fingers curling into a loose fist. The weight of Leonardo's words, "Strength is knowing when to walk away," echoed in his skull, louder than his Harley's roar ever could. He'd rolled into Willow Creek to dominate it, to bend it to his will with a laugh and a kick, but now he stood in the dirt, stripped bare by a man who didn't need to raise his voice or his fists to win. His gang shifted, their boots scuffing the ground, waiting for a signal, any signal, to tell them what came next. Johnny swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper, and muttered, "Let's go." His voice was barely audible, a broken whisper lost in the breeze, but it was enough. Tank nodded slowly, Razor and Spike exchanged glances, and one by one, the bikers turned toward their bikes, their steps heavy, their confidence left in the dust beside that untouched blade. The engines roared to life, a guttural growl tearing through the stillness, but it wasn't the triumphant thunder they'd arrived with. It was a retreat, a sound fading into the distance like a storm passing the horizon. Johnny climbed onto his Harley, his movements stiff, his leather jacket hanging off him like a shroud. He didn't look back, not at the knife, not at the cafe, not at Leonardo. He twisted the throttle and peeled out, his gang trailing behind, their silhouettes shrinking against the golden glow of the setting sun. The townsfolk watched them go, their murmurs turning to light laughter and sighs of relief. The waitress set down her tray shard, shaking her head with a grin. "That was a close one," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. The old shopkeeper leaned on his broom, chuckling. "Never thought I'd see the day a biker got schooled like that." The little girl broke free from her mother's arms, running to pet the golden retriever, her giggles ringing through the air as Willow Creek settled back into itself. Leonardo didn't linger to bask in the victory. He unhooked his dog's leashes, looping them around his hand, and stepped toward the Rusty Spoon's door. The cafe owner bustled out, his gray hair spilling over his shoulders, a wide smile breaking across his sun-weathered face. "That was something else, Mr. DiCaprio," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Never seen a man handle trouble like that without breaking a sweat. Coffee's on me, you've earned it." Leonardo nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks," he said simply, his voice carrying the same quiet strength that had silenced Johnny. He paused at the threshold, glancing back at the street. The dust had settled. The knife lay there like a forgotten relic, the townsfolk resuming their day with a newfound ease. "Some people need to learn the hard way," he added, almost to himself, then stepped inside, his dogs trotting loyally behind him. Days turned to weeks, and Willow Creek slipped back into its sleepy rhythm, the scent of pie wafting through the air, kids chasing balls on cracked sidewalks, the shopkeeper sweeping his porch with that same worn broom. But the story of that afternoon lingered, whispered over coffee cups and retold with wide-eyed excitement. The cafe owner laughed every time someone brought it up, shaking his head as he polished the counter. "I've seen plenty of tough guys roll through here," he'd say, "but I've never seen one taken down without so much as a fuss. Didn't even raise his voice." The little girl who'd petted the retriever reenacted it for her friends, mimicking Leonardo's steady steps and Johnny's dramatic fall with flair, her laughter ringing like a bell. "And then wham, he went down!" she'd shout, her friends clapping in delight. Johnny and his gang didn't come back. No one in Willow Creek saw their Harleys again, though rumors trickled down the road. Some said they'd taken a long detour. Others swore Johnny had sold his bike, too ashamed to ride after that day. The truth didn't matter. What lingered was the lesson carved into the town's memory, a tale passed from porch to porch like an heirloom. Leonardo had come and gone, a quiet storm leaving no wreckage, only clarity. He'd stepped into their world not to conquer it, not to prove anything, but to protect what was his. And in doing so, he'd shown them all what real strength meant. One quiet afternoon, as the sun dipped low and golden, a lone motorcycle rumbled into town. The townsfolk glanced up, a flicker of unease in their eyes, but it wasn't Johnny or his crew, just a traveler passing through, his engine humming softly as he nodded to the cafe owner and rolled on. The owner smiled, greeting him as he always did, and life went on. But that moment, that brief pause, reminded them of what they'd learned. Not every biker spelled trouble, and not every quiet man was weak. Some carried a strength that didn't need to shout, a power that only showed itself when it had to. Johnny, somewhere out there, carried that day with him, too. The roar of his Harley couldn't drown out the memory of Leonardo's voice, those sharp blue eyes, the choice he'd been given and taken despite himself. He didn't talk about it, not to Tank, not to anyone, but in the dead of night when the road stretched endless and empty, he'd feel it. A crack in the armor he'd worn too long, a whisper of something new. He'd kicked a dog to feel big, to make a mark, but Leonardo had shown him that real marks weren't made with boots or blades. They were made with control, with mercy, with the courage to let someone stand when you could crush them. And Willow Creek's lesson wasn't just for Johnny. It was for everyone who'd watched, everyone who'd retell the story. Strength wasn't the loudest roar or the hardest punch. It wasn't the crowd's cheers or the fear in someone's eyes. It was the quiet resolve to hold back when you could destroy, the wisdom to lift up instead of tear down, the grace to walk away when you'd already won. Leonardo didn't need to prove he was strong. His dogs knew it, the town saw it, and Johnny felt it in every aching bone. In the end, Johnny hadn't lost to a better fighter. He'd lost to a better man, and in that loss, he'd found a truth he couldn't outrun. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with fists, but with the choice to become more than you were.